From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I would say that Palestinian rights are not for sale, and we will not succumb to blackmail. There are imperatives and requirements for peace, and unilaterally, President Trump has destroyed them.
President Trump threatens to cut off hundreds of millions of dollars of annual aid to the UN's relief agency for Palestinian refugees in a move that could further destabilize the region. This comes as the International Criminal Court may soon open a war crimes probe into Israel's 2014 assault on Gaza and the ongoing expansion of settlements in the occupied West Bank. We'll look at the crisis in Gaza with scholar Norman Finkelstein, author of the new book, Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom.
Well, the two basic facts people should know about Gaza are, number one, Gaza consists overwhelmingly of refugees. Number two, Gaza consists overwhelmingly of children. Gaza has been under an Israeli occupation for the past half-century, and it has been under a brutal, one might even call it medieval siege, for more than a decade.
Today, Norman Finkelstein for the hour. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a major blow to President Trump's anti-immigration agenda, a U.S. judge in San Francisco has temporarily stopped the Trump administration from ending the DACA program. That's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. The Obama-era program gave nearly 800,000 young undocumented people legal permission to live and work in the United States. President Trump announced he was ending the program late last year. On Tuesday, U.S. District Judge William Alsup ruled the DACA program must remain in place in multiple lawsuits over Trump's decision to rescind the program. This comes after President Trump held an extraordinary meeting with Democratic and Republican lawmakers at the White House Monday, in which Trump appeared to support a wide-reaching deal on immigration that could grant millions of undocumented people a pathway to citizenship. During the meeting, Trump repeatedly said he would take the heat for a sweeping immigration deal, which would likely be opposed by much of his far-right-wing anti-immigrant base. President Trump also said he wanted a bill of love to protect the 800,000 young undocumented people known as Dreamers, whose protections he attempted to rescind last year. To the surprise of many, the majority of the meeting was televised, which aides said was meant to show the president's mental acuity amidst mounting questions about the president's mental health. But much of what Trump said during the televised meeting appeared to run counter to his campaign promises and his immigration policies, which have included demanding $18 billion in funding for a militarized border wall, rescinding DACA, and canceling immigration protections known as TPS for hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Sudanese immigrants who've been living in the United States for years. Following the meeting, a number of his right-wing supporters attacked Trump. He's already begun walking back his comments from the meeting, tweeting, "As I made very clear today, our country needs the security of the wall on the southern border, which must be part of any DACA approval," unquote. The Guardian's reporting the Trump administration's planning to loosen the restrictions on the use of nuclear weapons and develop a nuclear warhead for U.S. Trident missiles. This nuclear policy was outlined in a draft seen by a former Obama arms control official. It's significantly more hawkish than the previous administration's nuclear policy. This comes as President Trump's repeatedly threatened to deploy nuclear weapons against North Korea, proposed building up the U.S. nuclear arsenal, and has reportedly asked about nuclear weapons, quote, "If we had them, why can't we use them?" Meanwhile, South Korean President Moon Jae-in says he'd be willing to sit down with North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. The potential meeting comes after high-level officials from North and South Korea met in the demilitarized zone between the two countries for the first official talks in more than 2 years yesterday. At the talks, North Korea said it would send a delegation to the Winter Olympic Games being held next month in South Korea. The diplomacy is seeking to de-escalate the threat of nuclear war on the Korean peninsula, which has been largely sparked by President Trump's repeated threats to launch a nuclear strike against North Korea. Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, has resigned as head of the far right-wing news outlet Breitbart News, which has been described as an online haven for white nationalists and frequently publishes white nationalist propaganda. His departure from Breitbart comes after Bannon and President Trump had a public falling out over Bannon's quotes in the recently released book Fire and Fury Inside the Trump White House. In the book, Bannon's quoted as accusing Donald Trump Jr. of treason, predicting Robert Mueller's Russia investigation will find evidence of money laundering, and portraying his former boss as wholly unprepared for the presidency. Following the publication of the book, Bannon lost public support from many of his supporters, including billionaire backer Rebecca Mercer. In news from Washington, D.C., California Senator Dianne Feinstein released the transcript of a congressional interview with the founder of the research firm Fusion GPS, which was behind the dossier on the alleged collusion between President Trump's campaign and the Russian government. The dossier was compiled by a former British spy named Christopher Steele. It alleges there was a conspiracy of cooperation between the Trump campaign and Russian officials. This is California Senator Dianne Feinstein explaining why she released the transcript.
I think people are entitled to know what was said, and the lawyers also wanted it released. I see no problem with releasing it.
But Senator Feinstein, Senator Grassley says you've jeopardized their ability to get certain witnesses, like Kushner. Your reaction?
Oh, I don't think so. That's been difficult in any event. To my knowledge, there has not been a single fact in that report that has been proven to be incorrect, that it's really to muddy the waters and create a problem. You know, Steele brought this information into the FBI, and it's quite amazing that you get punished for providing information.
The founders of Fusion GPS asked for the transcripts to be released publicly. President Trump's lawyers have sued both Fusion GPS and BuzzFeed, the news outlet that first published the dossier. The notorious racist former Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio has announced he's running for Senate in the race to replace retiring Republican Senator Jeff Flake. Arpaio has been a major supporter of President Trump, who pardoned the ex-sheriff last year after he was convicted of contempt of court for defying an order to stop his deputies from racial profiling. For years, Arpaio ran a notoriously racist sheriff's department in Maricopa County, Arizona. He once bragged he ran an open-air tent city jail like a concentration camp. Arpaio was first elected in 1992, voted out of office in 2016 after Latinos organized a massive get-out-the-vote campaign. In an unprecedented ruling, federal judges have ruled North Carolina's congressional map unconstitutionally favors Republicans. The ruling marks the first time a federal court has struck down a congressional map because of political gerrymandering. The judges ruled the map violates the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection. Republicans have vowed to appeal Tuesday's ruling. The ruling gives Republicans 2 weeks to present a remedial plan to remap the congressional districts. In Libya, the Coast Guard says as many as 100 people may have died when a boat carrying refugees seeking to reach Europe sunk off Libya's coast Tuesday. Those who did survive were brought to a naval base in Tripoli, Libya. This is one of the survivors, Zeneb Abdesalam.
No.
I feel so disappointed because I could not make it to where I want to go. I feel so disappointed, and I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to go to prison.
In Pakistan, at least 6 people were killed in a suicide bomb attack targeting police officers in the southwestern city of Quetta Tuesday. The group known as the Pakistan Taliban claimed responsibility for the attack, saying it was in retaliation for the killing of its fighters by the Pakistani military. At least 16 more people were wounded in the explosion. Egypt's jailed 262 people for participating in the 2013 sit-in protests against the ouster of former President Mohamed Morsi. These sentences range from life in prison to 3 years in jail. Israel's facing a possible international criminal court probe over its 2014 assault on Gaza and continued expansion of settlements in the occupied West Bank. According to the Israeli TV station Channel 10, Israel's National Security Council recently warned Israeli lawmakers that the ICC could open an investigation at some point this year. This comes as the Israeli defense minister said Israel will approve the construction of hundreds of new settlement homes in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is facing a domestic political controversy after an Israeli TV station aired a secret audio recording of his son from outside a strip club in 2015. In the recording, Yair Netanyahu can be heard talking about prostitutes and demanding money from the son of an Israeli gas tycoon. Yair implies his father, Prime Minister Netanyahu, helped push through a $20 billion deal to benefit the businessman, saying, quote, "My dad arranged $20 billion for your dad, and you're whining with me about 400 shekels." This comes at a time when Benjamin Netanyahu is facing multiple corruption investigations. We'll have more on Israel and Palestine after headlines. Ecuador's foreign minister says WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's stay in the Ecuadorian embassy in London is untenable. Assange first sought refuge and political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in 2012 when he faced possible extradition to Sweden amidst a sexual assault investigation. The investigation has since been dropped. Assange denies the allegations and calls the investigation a pretext for his ultimate extradition to the United States to face prosecution under the Espionage Act. Ecuador is now calling on Assange's stay to be ended through international mediation. Back in the United States, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing Tuesday on a series of bizarre, unexplained health problems suffered by U.S. diplomats in Cuba. Officials originally said the health problems were caused by a likely sonic attack, but a new FBI report says there's no evidence of sonic waves being used in an attack in Havana. At Tuesday's Senate committee hearing, officials suggested the unexplained health problems might have been caused by an intentionally deployed virus. The Cuban government has denied any involvement in the alleged attack and says it's helping investigate the incidents. In financial news, the International Business Times reports the Trump administration's quietly waived part of the punishment for 5 major banks who were convicted of manipulating global interest rates. The banks are Citigroup, J.P. Morgan, Barclays, UBS, and Deutsche Bank, to which President Trump and his business empire owes at least $130 million in loans. The global interest rate manipulation scandal, known as the LIBOR scandal, involved banks illegally manipulating the interest rate, which underpins trillions in global transactions. In California, at least 13 people have died after torrential rains triggered mudslides in Santa Barbara County. At least 24 more people are missing, and authorities expect the death toll to rise. Scientists have linked extreme rainfall events to climate change. This is Santa Barbara County Sheriff Bill Brown.
While we hope it will not, we expect that this number will increase as we continue to look for people who are still missing and unaccounted for. We had a very difficult time assessing the area and responding to many of those areas to assist those people. The only words I can really think of to describe what it looked like was it looked like a World War I battlefield.
The torrential downpours and deadly mudslides in Santa Barbara, California, come only weeks after the region was ravaged by historic and deadly winter wildfires. In Madagascar, at least 29 people have been killed and tens of thousands more displaced from their homes after a cyclone hit the island nation off the southeastern coast of Africa over the weekend. This is Haingo Tina, who was displaced by the cyclone.
We are 6 in our family, and our house is completely submerged in water. My child has a strong fever, so we decided to come here to the displaced holding area. From morning, the moment you step down from your bed, you're forced to walk in water. Water is everywhere, and that is the reason we came
Meanwhile,
here.
A tsunami alert has been issued for wide swaths of Central America and the Caribbean after a magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck off the coast of Honduras. In more climate news, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio is slated to announce today New York City's divesting the city's 5 pension funds of $5 billion in fossil fuel investments. The New York City officials are citing climate change as the reason for the divestment. divestment, which they say is the largest of any municipality so far. New York City Controller Scott Stringer said, quote, safeguarding the retirement of our city's police officers, teachers, and firefighters is our top priority, and we believe that their financial future is linked to the sustainability of the planet, he said. In response, 350.org co-founder Bill McKibben tweeted, one of the biggest days in 30 years of the climate fight. Earth's mightiest city now in full-on fight with its richest, most irresponsible industry. The Trump administration's announced it's dropped plans to open up the waters off the coast of Florida to offshore oil and gas drilling, following fierce opposition by Florida's Republican Governor Rick Scott. The announcement comes after the Interior Department moved last week to allow offshore oil and gas drilling in nearly all of the United States coastal waters. The reversal of the Obama-era restrictions would open up more than 1 billion acres of water in the Arctic, Pacific, Atlantic, and Gulf of Mexico to offshore oil and gas drilling. And the reversal came after the Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke, met with Governor Scott in Florida. In Louisiana, a middle school English teacher named Aisha Hargrave was arrested in a now viral video after she stood up at a school board meeting and questioned why the superintendent was getting a raise when the teachers hadn't gotten a raise in years.
Superintendent, how are you going to take a raise when there's ELA? When I first started teaching ELA, there was like 20, 21 kids in a class, and now there's 29 kids in a class that we are now having, and we have not gotten raises. How are you going to take that money? Because it's basically taking out of the pockets of teachers.
Stop right now. That's not germane to what's on the agenda tonight.
Yes, it is. It's a raise. Come on now. How are you going to take?
What's on the agenda is the superintendent's contract.
With a raise. With a raise. Is it against policy to stand? Do not.
Hold on.
After her questioning, the teacher voluntarily left the room and was then forcibly arrested in the hallway by a marshal. Since Monday, the video has been seen by more than 1.5 million people. Actor James Franco has been accused of sexual misconduct by multiple women online, including actress Violet Paley, who tweeted, "Remember the time you pushed my head down in a car towards your exposed penis, and that other time you told my friend to come to your hotel when she was 17? Franco wore a Time's Up pin to the Golden Globe Awards Sunday. The Time's Up initiative was launched to combat sexual harassment and assault. This is James Franco denying the accusations during an interview last night on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert.
In my life, I pride myself on taking responsibility for things that I've done. I have to do that to maintain my well-being. I do it whenever I know that there's something wrong or needs to be changed. I make it a point to do it. The things that I heard that were on Twitter are not accurate.
James Franco won a Golden Globe for Best Actor in a Motion Picture. And some lawmakers are planning to wear black during President Trump's first State of the Union address later this month to protest sexual harassment and assault and to show solidarity with the Me Too and Time's Up movements seeking to end gender violence and abuse. President Trump has been accused of sexual harassment, assault, or misconduct by at least 16 women. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. When we come back from break, we turn to Israel and Palestine. Israel facing a possible International Criminal Court war crimes probe over its 2014 assault on Gaza. Our guest, scholar Norman Finkelstein, out with a new book, Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. Stay with us. Music by Latrio Gibran here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Israel's facing a possible International Criminal Court war crimes probe over its 2014 assault on Gaza and the ongoing expansion of settlements in the occupied West Bank. According to the Israeli TV station Channel 10, Israel's National Security Council recently warned Israeli lawmakers that the ICC could open an investigation at some point this year. Despite the warning, the Israeli defense minister announced Tuesday Israel will approve the construction of hundreds of new settlement homes in the West Bank. Palestinian leaders began calling for an ICC probe soon after the 2014 assault on Gaza, which killed more than 2,100 Palestinians, including over 500 children. This comes as Israel and the United States are facing growing international condemnation over their treatment of Palestinians. Last month, the United Nations voted 128-9 in favor of a resolution calling for the United States to drop its recent recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Meanwhile, on Tuesday, Sweden criticized the Trump administration for threatening to cut off hundreds of millions of dollars of annual aid to the UN's relief agency for Palestinian refugees. Sweden's ambassador to the United Nations said the cutting off of the aid, quote, would be destabilizing for the region. Palestinian legislator Hanan Ashrawi compared President Trump's threat to cut off aid money to blackmail.
I would say that Palestinian rights are not for sale, and we will not succumb to blackmail. There are imperatives and requirements for peace, and unilaterally, President Trump has destroyed them. He has even sabotaged our efforts at achieving a just peace and getting freedom and dignity for the Palestinian people. By recognizing occupied Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, he has not only disqualified himself as a peace broker or a mediator, by taking sides and by becoming complicit in Israel's occupation, he has also totally sabotaged, he has totally destroyed the very foundations of peace.
Part of the UN aid money goes to refugees living in occupied Gaza, the most densely populated area in the world. For years, the United Nations and aid groups have warned conditions in Gaza are almost unlivable due to the decade-long Israeli military blockade and multiple Israeli assaults on the region. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, 7 out of 10 people in Gaza live off humanitarian aid. The unemployment rate, 44%. Electricity cuts can reach up to 20 hours every day. Gaza is the subject of a new book by the author and scholar Norman Finkelstein. It's titled Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. Norman Finkelstein is the son of Holocaust survivors. He's the author of many other books, including The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Human Suffering, and Knowing Too Much, Why the American-Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End. Norman Finkelstein, welcome back to Democracy Now! Let's begin with the latest news of this report of a possible ICC, International Criminal Court, war crimes probe into the Israeli assault on Gaza in 2014.
Well, there's been long-standing ICC investigations of Israeli conduct, and this is another phase, the report in the Israeli press, that it's moving along. The chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, she has been very soft, as has the previous ICC chief prosecutor, when it comes to prosecuting anyone except Africans. Since the founding of the ICC in 1998, the only persons who have ever been tried are African leaders or Africans accused of significant human rights crimes. It's called by the many African states, it's called the International Caucasian Court, not Criminal Court. What will come of this? It's unclear. It's possible that the chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, will use the Palestine case to demonstrate that not only Africans are prosecuted, as a way of demonstrating that she's going to break the precedent. I myself have contacted her because, as I said, it's been an ongoing process. And what happened in 2014, which I discuss at length in my book, is part of the investigation. And people who know her and have been enthusiastic about my manuscript have also contacted her. I would also just want to make one point. Of course, an investigation would be a good thing. Of course, an investigation is warranted. However, we have to bear in mind that the Palestinians have won many important political and legal victories. In 2004, the International Court of Justice found in favor of the Palestinians across the board. Then there was the Goldstone Report, which was another important victory. The problem is not that the Palestinians lack in political and legal victories. The problem is that the Palestinian leadership, or so-called leadership, has never translated the legal and political victories into something practical on the ground. And so even if, and I'm hoping it'll happen, but even if there's an ICC victory for the Palestinians, even on that remote possibility, the problem is, what do you do with it? And the Palestinian leadership has never done anything with its victories.
So before we get into your inquest into Gaza, I want to also ask about this threat of the U.S. cutting off millions of dollars to UNRWA, to the Palestinian Refugee Agency. Explain the significance of this agency and why Palestinians rely on this so much.
Okay. First of all, you have to bear in mind that 70% of Palestinians in Gaza, let's just call them Gazans, 70% of Gazans are classified as refugees. That means technically actual refugees and children of refugees, but under the categorization used in Gaza, they're all classified as refugees, so that's 70%. Secondly, half of Gaza's population, or slightly more, are children. And so you have this overwhelmingly refugee child population, and they rely overwhelmingly on UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. UNRWA is financed between 25% and 30% by the United States, and that comes to about $300 million a year. And so the threat of cutting the money to UNRWA would be devastating for an already devastated population, overwhelmingly children. Nonetheless, I would like to keep things in proportion. So it would be a catastrophe, no doubt about it, if UNRWA is defunded by the United States. However, let's look at the numbers. We're talking about $300 million annually. Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, he paid $500 million for a yacht. That would have covered all of UNRWA's expenses, the American portion, for more than a year. He paid $450 million for a Da Vinci painting. That would have covered all U.S. expenses, again, for more than a year. He paid $300 million for a house in Versailles. That would have covered all the UNRWA expenses by the United States. And God only knows how much money he paid for Tom Friedman's column in the New York Times.
Well, why don't you explain what you're referring to, the op-ed piece in the New York Times about Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia.
There are young people here, so I have to be careful about my language, but all it was a very expensive...
Be careful. No cursing on this.
No, it's not cursing, but it was a verbal blowjob. Probably the most expensive one in world history, that was administered to Mohammed bin Salman. The column he wrote in the Times, it was vintage Tom Friedman. He goes into Saudi Arabia for 3 days, says everything is wonderful, talks to the Crown Prince's sister, who's representative of the people of Saudi Arabia, says they're all very enthusiastic about him, and then he walks away and writes this column.
Hardly mentioning in this column, among other issues, Yemen. Well, Mohammed bin Salman, who is in charge of the U.S.-backed Saudi assault on Yemen.
Yes, well, Yemen is... Look, the fact of the matter is that every reactionary, every regressive movement in the Arab world is financed by the Saudis, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Bahrain, whether it's Syria, whether it's Egypt, everywhere. It's the Saudi money, and it's also, incidentally, the Saudi money that keeps the Palestinian Authority afloat. That's why they have to pay pay deference to the Saudis. It's a wretched, parasitic regime.
What about Jared Kushner's relationship with Mohammed bin Salman, and how does that play in here? He's gone repeatedly to Saudi Arabia. Jared Kushner, senior advisor to his father-in-law, President Trump, apparently is in charge of the Middle East peace process, and they have apparently cooked up a plan, Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman, for peace in the Middle East.
Well, first of all, we have to look at the context. Jared Kushner knows nothing about anything. Jared Kushner is only there because he's married to Trump's daughter. He's the son of Charles Kushner. Charles Kushner is a real estate mogul, a billionaire who has the distinguishing characteristic of actually having been arrested and spending time in jail. Now, that's very rare.
By Chris Christie when he was a prosecutor in New Jersey.
That's very rare in the United States for a billionaire to spend time in jail. Among other things, he hired a prostitute and had her photographed in order to hired a prostitute to have his brother-in-law photographed, and then presented the video to his wife at some family gathering. Jared Kushner, he got into Harvard University because the year he applied, his father gave $2.3 million to Harvard. Everybody agreed he didn't have the grades, he didn't have the test scores. These are people who profit from their parents' profit. There's no known knowledge that he possesses about the Middle East. And incidentally, it's the same thing with Mohammed bin Salman. His only interest has only one interest. And of course, the interest is to maintain his power. But the Saudi regime is a parasitic regime. Work, literally, in Saudi Arabia, work is the four-letter word. If you say that you have a job, that you work, the Saudi ruling class looks at you with contempt. You work? And so the Saudis know in their now battle with Iran, they know that they couldn't prevail against Iran on a military level, on a strategic level. You know, Iran is a 5,000-year-old civilization. It's a very impressive place. And so they're hoping that the United States and Israel will take their chestnuts out of the fire. So they want Israel and the United States to go to war with Iran. And so they're willing to do anything. You know, they'll give away Palestine. They'll give away this studio. They'll purchase it and give it away to get the United States and Israel to do their bidding. So we're not really talking about a peace plan. We're talking about handing Israel everything it wants in exchange for Israel and the United States taking out Iran.
I wanted to ask you about Benjamin Netanyahu and the corruption investigations he's facing. Of course, Benjamin Netanyahu recently speaking about his very close relationship with the Kushners, sleeping in Jared Kushner's bedroom when he visited the United States when he was a little boy. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu facing a domestic political controversy after an Israeli TV station aired a secret audio recording of his son from outside a strip club in 2015. In the recording, Yair Netanyahu can be heard talking about prostitutes, demanding money from the son of an Israeli gas tycoon. Yair implies that his father, Prime Minister Netanyahu helped push through a $20 billion deal to benefit the businessmen, saying, quote, "My dad arranged $20 billion for your dad, and you're whining with me about 400 shekels." This coming at a time when Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing multiple corruption investigations. In September, Yair Netanyahu also faced controversy when he posted an anti-Semitic cartoon on Facebook. White supremacists, including former Klan leader David Duke, praised Yair Netanyahu, posting an image depicting billionaire investor George Soros at the top of a food chain, dangling the world in front of both a reptile, and former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, a frequent critic of his father, Benjamin Netanyahu, and then being tweeted praise by David Duke. It's an astounding story written about in Slate and other places. Can you talk about what is happening now, and does the corruption investigations jeopardize Netanyahu? And what about his son?
Well, I'll just look at the last point briefly and then get to the heart, in my opinion, the heart of the questions you're asking. The relationship between his son and Netanyahu, Yair, and his father, Benjamin Netanyahu, it's very similar to Jared and Donald Trump. These are privileged, spoiled, and remarkably unremarkable individuals. But the question you asked about the corruption in general, it's an interesting question. You're not quite as old as me, but you can go back far enough to remember that when we were growing up, Israel was a very austere, it was a simple, and it was a pretty honest place. And that's the image of Israel that retains in the minds of many American Jews, say over the age of 50. And so back then, let's say you take in the 1970s, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister, he had to leave office. He was forced out of office because his wife had opened up a bank account, one bank account in the United States, and apparently there wasn't even any money deposited in it, if my memory is correct. But nowadays, it's just one scandal after another scandal, after another scandal, after another scandal. And the remarkable thing is, it doesn't really affect Benjamin Netanyahu's standing. You can have a succession of scandals, but he has been in office for a remarkably long period of time. And then the question is, why? And I think the answer is because whether one likes it or not, Benjamin Netanyahu is the true face of Israel. He's an obnoxious, loudmouth, racist, Jewish supremacist, and that's the whole population now. Now, I'm not saying it's in their DNA. I'm not saying it's genetic. But it is a very sorry thing that the state of Israel has degenerated into. And
I mean, it's clearly not the entire population. You have so many critics. You have a peace movement there.
I would say, Amy, I would wish that were the case. I would wish that were the case. But if you ask the critics themselves, if you ask a Gideon Levy, you ask an Amir Haas,
who write for Haaretz,
right? You ask Bet Selem, you ask
the Human Rights Group,
right? Breaking the Silence, the Soldiers Group. They'll tell you they represent nobody. They'll tell you they don't represent anymore. There was a period where they represented at least a factor in Israeli life, but it's no longer true. And the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu endures, despite the succession of scandals, is a manifestation of how much that society has degenerated. So, Gideon Levy, I think, the columnist, he made a comment the other day, which I found very interesting. He said, the Israelis, they see a fellow in a wheelchair. He lost both his legs in Gaza. He's holding a flag. They shoot him right between the eyes, a sharpshooter. Everybody sees it on video. He says, no Israelis cared. Then another kid is killed. In this case, the second case, a kid is killed. A third is killed. Nobody cares. One thing they care about. The young girl, Ahed Tamimi, smacked an Israeli soldier. That causes hysteria. How dare a Palestinian smack an Israeli soldier? but the daily atrocities.
And this, again, the smacking of the soldier after her 14-year-old cousin, who was shot at very close range in the face, just coming out of a coma right now by Israeli soldiers.
And living through an occupation, living through the ransacking, the ravaging of your home, your neighborhoods, these soldiers constantly harassing you, hectoring you, browbeating you, threatening you. But the only question for Israel is, how dare this girl smack a soldier in the face? But the killings are meaningless.
Before we get to speak more extensively about Gaza, I wanted to quickly ask you what you felt the motivation was for President Trump recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, saying he'd move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv, the massive response in the United Nations after he announced this recognition, the overwhelming vote against the United States, and the United States threatening people who voted against them.
Well, it's a little complicated question how U.S.-Israeli policy works, but in general you could say when major U.S. national interests are at stake, the Israel lobby has very little power. We saw that, for example, during the negotiations over the agreement with Iran. That was a major U.S. national interest. The lobby was dead set against it. Netanyahu was dead set against it, but the agreement went through. And many of Israel's strongest supporters, Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, the whole gang, they supported the agreement. But when a major U.S. interest is not at stake, the lobby is quite powerful. So you take in this particular case, it was clear the Saudis, which is a U.S. major interest, they didn't care what the U.S. did with Jerusalem. They gave the green light. If you want to give it to Israel, that's fine with us. We don't care. So no U.S. national interest is at stake. And so Trump does what anybody does. He rewards his donors. In this case, it was Sheldon Adelson, the casino billionaire, who was strongly supporting the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel. But we have to bear in mind, it wasn't just Trump. You know, sometimes the media wants to pile up on Trump, and they forget it's not just Trump. Charles Schumer, the current Senate minority leader, Schumer was constantly attacking Trump right after he got elected. Why aren't you recognizing Jerusalem as the undivided capital? When Trump did recognize it, Charles Schumer, he said he did it because of me. I was the one that urged him to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So that's the Senate minority leader speaking. And for the same reason. If you look at Schumer's money, he gets it mostly from conservative right-wing Jews and from Wall Street, the same sources of income as Trump, the same streams of income. And on these questions, a lot of the Democrats, including Schumer, or especially Schumer, I should say, are worse than Trump. So, for example, after the Mavi Marmara incident in 2010, when Israel killed the passengers aboard the humanitarian vessel, the Mavi Marmara killed 10 passengers. Charles Schumer, he went before a group of Orthodox Jews, and he said, the people of Gaza voted for Hamas. They voted for Hamas, and therefore economic strangulation is the way to go. Now, bear in mind what that means. We're talking about a population, more than half of which are children, who are living under a medieval siege. And what he's effectively saying is we should continue starving them until they vote or get rid of Hamas. Now, what do you say about something like that? You know, Charles Schumer, he went to my high school, as did, incidentally, Bernie Sanders. I didn't know him. He was, I think, 4 years ahead of me. I knew his sister pretty well, Fran, extremely bright. You know, even now, looking back almost a half century, she still stands vividly in my memory, extremely bright young woman. They were decent, actually. Chuck's, as he was called, Chuck, his father was an exterminator. You know, that's really rising. It was an impressive show. He was an extremely bright guy. He was valedictorian of his class, and he was way ahead of everybody else, as was Friend, you know? But what they turned into, what can you say? He grew up in Kings Highway in Brooklyn, right near where Bernie grew up, by the way. I passed the house every day because I bicycled to the pool. What do you say about a person who recommends starving children? That's what he did. He's a moral monster, and you have to face up to that fact. He's a moral monster, and yet everybody wants to dump on Trump. What about people like Schumer?
Well, we're going to break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the situation you're describing in Gaza. Your new book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. We're speaking with author and scholar Norman Finkelstein. The book has just been published. Stay with us.
Listen to the wind and everything around you. Make way for the future, but appreciate what is now. No need to ask me about the future, 'cause all I have now is what I've got to face. Listen to the wind and everything around you, baby, Make way for the
Listen to the Wind by Kalu James here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest today, author and scholar Norman Finkelstein, author of the new book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. The book published as Israel's facing a possible International Criminal Court war crimes probe over its 2014 assault on Gaza, which killed more than 2,100 Palestinians, including over 500 children. I want to turn to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, talking about the 2014 military offensive in Gaza. He was speaking to Brian Williams of NBC News.
You know, at a certain point, you say, what choice have you got? What would you do? What would you do if American cities, where you're sitting now, Brian, would be rocketed, would absorb hundreds of rockets? You know what would you'd say? You'd say to your leader, a man's got to do what a man's got to do, and you'd say a country's got to do what a country's got to do. We have to defend ourselves. We try to do it with the minimum amount of force, or with targeting military targets as best as we can, but we'll act to defend ourselves. No country can live like this.
That was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu justifying the 2014 military offensive in Gaza, that the International Criminal Court is apparently about to open up a war crimes investigation into.
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu says two things. Number one, Israel had no option. And number two, that it used the minimum amount of force. Well, let's look quickly at those 2 points. Point number one, everybody agreed that the reason they went, once the fighting began, Hamas had one goal. The goal was to end the siege of Gaza, to lift the siege. Under international law, that siege is illegal. It constitutes collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. The siege has been condemned by everybody in the international community. He had an option. He didn't have to use force. He simply had to lift the siege. And then there wouldn't have been a conflict with Gaza. Number two, he claims he used minimum force. There's a lot to say about that. You can decide for yourself whether it's minimum force when Israel leveled 18,000 homes. How many Israeli homes were leveled? One. Israel killed 550 children. How many Israeli children were killed? One. Now, you might say, well, that's because Israel has a sophisticated civil defense system, or Israel has Iron Dome. I won't go into that. I don't have time now. but there's a simple test. The test is, what did the Israeli combatants themselves see? What did they themselves say? We have the documentation, a report put out by the Israeli ex-service, ex-combatant organization, Breaking the Silence. It's about 110 pages. You couldn't believe it. You know, I'll tell you, Amy, I still remember when I was reading it. I was in Turkey. I was going to a book festival. I was sitting in the back of a car and reading these descriptions of what the soldiers did. My skin was crawling. I was like shaking. Soldier after soldier after soldier. Now bear in mind, you want to say they're partisan, the soldiers? Read the testimonies. They're not contrite. They're not remorseful. They're just describing what happened. There's no contrition. These aren't lefties, supporters of BDS. What do they describe? One after another says, our orders were shoot to kill anything that moves and anything that doesn't move. One after another says, Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used lunatic amounts of firepower in Gaza.
These were the Israeli soldiers.
The soldiers, they're describing it. One after another says, we blew up, destroyed, systematically, methodically razed every house in sight. What does that mean, every house in sight? 70% of the people in Gaza, they're refugees. It means they lost their homeland. The last thing they have, the only thing they have, the only thing they've ever had is their home. And the Israelis went in like a wrecking crew with their D9 bulldozers.
Explain how it began.
How what?
How the 2014 Israeli military invasion of Gaza
these
began.
are hard things to explain because it depends on where you want to start. Where I start is at the end of April 2014, a national unity government was formed between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. And the United States and the EU, surprisingly, they didn't break off negotiations with this new unity government, although it included a terrorist organization. And it enraged Netanyahu.
You're using air quotes. You're saying what the U.S. called a terrorist
organization.
organization.
What Israel calls a terrorist organization, because at that time the U.S. was willing to negotiate. And Netanyahu went into a rage because he was being ignored over Iran. Now he's being ignored over Hamas. And so he finds a pretext. I don't want to go into the details now. He finds a pretext to try to provoke Hamas into reacting so that he can say, you see, they're a terrorist organization. And then it quickly spiraled downwards, as it typically does. And then Israel went in. There was the air assault. And then July 17th, the day the Malaysian airliner went down over the Ukraine, Netanyahu used that moment. The plane was down in the afternoon, and he launches the ground invasion in the evening. You'd be surprised how finely attuned the Israelis are to the American news cycle. They begin Operation Protective Edge in 2008 with Obama's election to the presidency on November 4th. They begin the ground invasion of Gaza during 2004 was Operation Cast Lead. They begin Cast Lead on November 4th, 2008, when Obama's elected president. They begin Operation Protective Edge, then ground invasion, on July 17th, when the airliner is downed over the Ukraine. All the cameras are now riveted over there, and so they launched the attack. And the attack was, well, let me just quote to you Peter Maurer, who was the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I was even surprised by his remark. Peter Maurer said, and I'm quoting him, paraphrasing him, but almost verbatim, he said, in my entire professional life, I have never seen destruction as I saw in Gaza. And that's coming from the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who is accustomed to witnessing war zones. What was done there was, It was a crime against humanity. You take a place like Shujaiya. Shujaiya, it's a very densely populated neighborhood of 90,000 people. Israel dropped, believe it or not, it's hard to even fathom, more than 100 one-ton bombs on Shujaiya. More than 100 one-ton bombs on Shujaiya. Did the same thing to Rafah, did the same thing to Kuza, did the same thing to the whole Gaza Strip. And then you have this guy come along, and he said, we used discriminate force, we used proportionate force.
I wanted to go to after an attack on a UN shelter in 2014, the Israeli military attacking in Gaza, which killed many Palestinian civilians. The spokesperson for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, broke down and cried during an interview on Al Jazeera. His name is Christopher Gunnis.
The rights of Palestinians, even their children, are wholesale denied, and it's appalling.
Christopher Gunnis is starting to cry.
My pleasure.
That's Christopher Gunnis as the camera turns away from him, his head in his hands, later tweeting, "There are times when tears speak more eloquently than words, mine pale into insignificance compared with Gaza's." Norman Finkelstein, we have 2 minutes left.
I happen to know Chris Gunnis. He's a really terrific guy. I hope he doesn't lose his job because I said that. But he is a special guy. He's an unusual guy. He worked in Gaza. He's married to a man, he's married to a Jewish man, and he's married to an Israeli man. So you can imagine that Hamas was not thrilled with him. But he's very principled, and the tears were real. Anybody who lives there, has even passed through there, their heart breaks. That's what's been done to the people of Gaza.
What do you think needs to be done now?
Well, it's clear the first thing that has to be done is the siege has to be lifted. And the UN Human Rights Council, although its report was a total and complete whitewash and disgrace, Mary McGowan Davis was the author of it, they did say, according to the law, the siege has to be lifted immediately and unconditionally. That's the law. It has to be lifted immediately and unconditionally. That's the first thing that has to be done. The siege has to end, the occupation has to end, and the people of Gaza, after 50 godforsaken years, should have the right to breathe and live a normal life.
And how do you think that's going to happen?
It's a very tough moment right now, but there are always possibilities. In my opinion, there is the possibility in Gaza of a nonviolent mass resistance trying to force open the checkpoints. And the West Bank, I don't have time to go through it now. I think a mass strategy of smacking Israeli soldiers, women and girls, in the footsteps of Ahid Tamimi, that kind of strategy.
Who faces many years in prison right
yes,
now.
Nobody's saying it's without risks.
10 seconds.
But just as the children of Gaza, when they threw stones at the Israelis in 1988 during the first Intifada, shifted international public opinion, I think the women of Gaza, if they have a Me Too campaign, I smacked an Israeli soldier today, I think that can win international public opinion also.
You talked about a nonviolent campaign throughout the occupied areas.
Look, I'm in the tradition of Gandhi, and Gandhi was very clear. When you're facing huge odds against you, and you use kinds of force like scratching, slapping,
3
kicking,
seconds.
Gandhi said that's not violence.
Norman Finkelstein, author of Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.